The illusion of perfection. The grandeur of the Randolph estate was undeniable. Nestled in the rolling hills outside the city, the mansion stood like a gleaming monument to old money. Its white stone columns, towering over the perfectly manicured gardens, gleamed under the fading afternoon sun. The estate was far more than just a home, it was a symbol of timeless wealth and the kind of quiet arrogance that only generations of inherited riches could afford. Every corner of the property, every blade of grass, seemed to whisper secrets of an ancient lineage, secrets that Jacqueline Morris had never fully understood but had been expected to respect. Inside, beneath glittering chandeliers made of hand-cut crystal, Jacqueline stood before an enormous, antique mirror in the bridal suite. Her reflection stared back at her, tall and composed, draped in the luxurious fabric of her wedding gown. The gown itself was a masterpiece, an ivory satin that clung to her frame, the bodice intricately embroidered with delicate beads that sparkled like stars under the dim lighting. Her makeup was perfect, her dark skin glowing under the carefully applied foundation. Her hair was styled to perfection, sleek and glossy, cascading in soft waves down her back. To the world, she appeared every bit the fairy tale bride. But to Jacqueline, nothing about this moment felt fairy tale-like. The weight of the gown was heavier than it seemed, and not just because of its rich fabric. It felt as though it carried with it all the expectations of the life she was about to step into, a life that was not her own. She had worked for this, yes, but only because her family had insisted that it was the right choice. Thomas Randolph, her fiancé, was the heir to the Randolph fortune, a man of social stature, refined tastes, and an impeccable pedigree. In the eyes of her parents, this marriage represented the perfect union between the old world of aristocracy and the new age of cutting-edge technology, where the power of legacy merged with the power of progress. Yet as Jacqueline stood in the suite, the soft hum of the distant orchestra reaching her ears, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. It had been months now, months of carefully crafted smiles and polite conversations. Her heart, however, had been silent through it all, and today, it spoke loud and clear. This marriage was not built on love. It was built on the weight of obligations. It was a business arrangement, a strategic partnership that would merge two powerful families. Nothing more, nothing less. Jacqueline's mind raced back to the days leading up to this moment. She had met Thomas in college, their families having arranged their first meeting during a gala that both families had attended. At first, there was charm, he was courteous, sophisticated, and seemingly well-versed in the art of high society. He was everything a woman like Jacqueline was expected to desire. They made an ideal match, on paper. He was educated, polished, and had the kind of pedigree that matched her own family's growing empire. But after months of getting to know him, Jacqueline had begun to notice something she hadn't seen at first. Beneath the polished surface, Thomas was distant, his attention often more focused on the expectations of his family than on any connection with her. He was a man consumed by the idea of maintaining appearances, his love a carefully curated performance. Their conversations often felt scripted, rehearsed. The more she saw, the more Jacqueline realized that she was not marrying a man for love, she was marrying an image, a symbol of the status she had been raised to respect but never truly understand. Her family had always been different. Jacqueline had grown up watching her parents, self-made billionaires who had built their empire from the ground up. They had no old money to lean on, no centuries-old estates to fall back on. What they had was vision, drive, and an unwavering belief in the power of modernity. The Morris family name had become synonymous with technology and innovation. They were the leaders of a new world, one where success was measured not by the past but by the future. Their wealth was real, built on the shoulders of her parents' tireless work and ingenuity. It was a wealth she had inherited, but it was also a wealth that came with its own set of expectations. The moment she had accepted Thomas's proposal, Jacqueline knew she was not just marrying a man. She was marrying into a world that valued lineage above all else. A world that expected her to uphold the ideals of wealth, power, and influence, even if those ideals were no longer as solid as they once seemed. The Randolph family had wealth, yes, but it was a wealth that was slowly fraying at the edges. Their vast holdings were beginning to crumble beneath the weight of old debts and poor investments. What was once a proud legacy was now teetering on the edge of irrelevance, its fading splendor hidden behind layers of opulence and carefully constructed facades. She glanced at her reflection again, but this time, the woman she saw staring back at her seemed more like a stranger. Was this the life she wanted? Was this the woman she had dreamed of becoming? The fairy tale she had once imagined was gone, replaced by a cold reality that neither she nor Thomas seemed willing to acknowledge. As if to snap herself out of the growing panic in her chest, Jacqueline took a deep breath. The wedding was about to begin. There was no turning back now. Her parents had already arrived, their faces beaming with pride, as if this was the culmination of a lifetime's worth of hard work and sacrifice. Thomas's family, the Randolphs, stood ready to celebrate the continuation of their storied name. There would be no turning back from this moment, not without consequences. Maria, her maid of honor, entered the room with a wide grin, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "You're stunning, Jackie," Maria said, her voice full of admiration. She stepped closer, adjusting Jacqueline's veil and smoothing out the folds of her gown. "Everything is perfect. You're ready." Jacqueline smiled faintly, though the smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "I guess I am," she said softly. As Maria moved to leave, she hesitated at the door, her gaze lingering on Jacqueline. "Is everything okay? You seem distant." Jacqueline's heart skipped a beat. For a moment, she considered telling Maria the truth about how she was feeling, about the sense of dread that had been following her for months. But no words came. Instead, she forced another smile. "I'm fine, Maria." "Really? Just a little nervous." Maria nodded, satisfied with the answer, though Jacqueline could tell that her friend didn't quite believe her. "Well, your moment's coming. The guests are waiting. You're going to be amazing." Jacqueline nodded again, though her heart felt anything but amazing. She wasn't ready for this life. She wasn't ready to be the wife of a man she barely knew. But as the sound of the guests' laughter and chatter filtered through the walls, Jacqueline knew there was no other choice. This was the path she had been groomed to follow. With one final glance at her reflection, she adjusted her veil and took a deep breath. "Let's do this," she murmured, stepping toward the door. The world beyond the bridal suite awaited her, but she could not shake the nagging feeling that her story was far from the fairy tale everyone had imagined. Little did Jacqueline know, the night ahead would be nothing like the one she had envisioned, and it would change her life forever. The ill-fated ceremony. The wedding was nothing short of grand. It was as if the entire estate had been transformed into a living dream, a showcase of wealth and power that seemed to stretch on endlessly. The air outside was crisp, carrying a faint scent of flowers from the gardens that had been meticulously arranged in anticipation of the day. Guests arrived in sleek cars, each more polished than the next, and the buzz of high society chatter filled the halls of the Randolph mansion. The ballroom, where the ceremony would take place, was bathed in golden light from the chandeliers that hung overhead like rare jewels. The floor was a perfect mirror of polished marble, reflecting the grandeur of the room. Above them, massive portraits of the Randolph ancestors gazed down impassively, as though silently judging the gathering below. The opulence of the setting was designed to overwhelm the senses. And yet, as Jacqueline entered the room, she felt a peculiar emptiness within herself that no amount of lavish decoration could fill. She walked down the aisle with a composed but cold smile, her step steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. The guests, seated in rows, stood in unison as she passed. The faces that looked up at her were filled with admiration, genuine or performative, she couldn't tell. The women admired her gown, no doubt, the fine cut and the way the fabric shimmered under the light. The men, in their tuxedos, took note of her beauty, some of them perhaps with a hint of envy in their eyes. Jacqueline, however, was oblivious to their gazes, her mind focused on the one person she was walking toward, Thomas. Thomas stood at the altar, framed by a towering arch of white flowers and golden ribbons, his tall, well-groomed figure a sharp contrast to the sea of perfectly dressed guests around him. He looked every bit the part of the handsome heir to an old fortune, his dark brown hair slicked back, and his eyes filled with the kind of controlled intensity that suggested he was always a few steps ahead in whatever game he was playing. But as Jacqueline neared, she felt an overwhelming sense of detachment, as though the distance between them was far greater than the few feet separating them physically. His smile was the same calculated one she had seen countless times, the kind that seemed more like a performance than an expression of genuine emotion. And yet, Jacqueline couldn't help but notice that his lips curved slightly as she approached, as if he were pleased with the way everything was unfolding, pleased with the flawless image they presented as a couple. Her hand met his, and for a moment, Jacqueline could feel the weight of the world pressing down on her. This wasn't just a marriage, it was a merger of two powerful families, two dynasties that had been intertwined for generations. She could feel the expectations of both families, the Randolphs with their fading empire, the Morizes with their booming tech empire, pressing down on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. The officiant, an elderly man with a thin, pinched face and an air of practiced reverence, began the ceremony. His voice was smooth and steady, but Jacqueline found it hard to focus. Her mind kept wandering back to the life she was about to step into. What had happened to the dreams she had once nurtured? What had happened to the woman she had once hoped to become? She wasn't sure when the love had slipped away, but now, as she stood there, all she could feel was the weight of the life she was being forced to accept. The officiant's words blurred as Jacqueline's gaze shifted toward the guests. The Randolph family sat to her left, their faces unreadable, their eyes fixed on the proceedings. Thomas's father, Gregory Randolph, was seated next to his wife, Sylvia, both impeccably dressed in designer gowns and suits, their posture regal as ever. The Morris side, on the right, appeared a bit more relaxed, but they, too, wore their polished smiles, even though Jacqueline could sense their underlying pride, their desire for this union to solidify the merging of the old and new worlds. As Thomas spoke his vows, his voice deep and sincere, Jacqueline couldn't help but feel a flicker of discomfort. He spoke of loyalty, of family, of the future they would build together. His words were perfect, polished, rehearsed, like a script that had been written and memorized years ago. And yet, as he finished, Jacqueline's heart didn't flutter. She didn't feel that warmth or connection that a bride was supposed to feel. Instead, she felt nothing. His words, so carefully constructed, seemed empty, like they were meant to please the crowd rather than speak to her. Then, it was her turn. The officiant turned to Jacqueline, and she was jolted out of her thoughts. The room fell silent, as if every guest were waiting for her to speak, to declare her devotion, her commitment, her readiness for this new life. She took a deep breath, her chest tight with anxiety. "I vow to stand beside you, Thomas," she began, her voice steady but lacking the warmth she had hoped to feel. "To support the legacy we are creating. To honor the family we are joining." The words felt stiff on her tongue, as though they weren't her own, as though they were part of a script she was expected to recite without question. There was no mention of love, no promise of mutual respect, no hope for a shared future that was based on anything more than duty. It was a pledge built on expectations, a pledge that felt more like an obligation than a desire. As the officiant spoke the final words of their union, Jacqueline's mind drifted back again to her childhood. She had been raised in a world of sharp business deals, late-night strategy sessions, and relentless ambition. She had always been told that success wasn't about emotions, that emotions were a luxury, a weakness. What mattered was the deal, the acquisition of power, wealth, and influence. And this marriage, it seemed, was just another deal. A deal that would bind her to a man who did not truly see her. A deal that would bind her to a family she barely knew. The officiant's voice broke through her thoughts. "I now pronounce you husband and wife." The words hung in the air, but Jacqueline could hardly hear them. The applause that erupted around her seemed distant, muted, as though she were underwater. She smiled, because that was what she was supposed to do. She allowed Thomas to pull her into a kiss that was supposed to seal their vows, but it felt more like a formality, a mere formality that was meant to appease the onlookers. The kiss was brief, the crowd applauded, and Jacqueline felt a strange emptiness settle in her chest. As the ceremony came to an end and the guests began to filter out toward the reception hall, Jacqueline allowed herself a moment to breathe. She felt the weight of her gown, but she also felt the weight of the decision she had made. She had married for reasons that had little to do with her own desires, and now she was bound to a life that wasn't hers. But there was no turning back. She stood at the side of the room, watching as Thomas spoke with various guests, his face lit with the thrill of the occasion. He was the perfect groom, polished, composed, admired by all. But Jacqueline felt as if she were standing in the middle of a play, an observer of a performance that was slowly but surely unraveling. It was as though she were playing a part in a world that didn't belong to her. The reception continued around her, but Jacqueline found herself losing interest in the spectacle. The champagne flowed, the laughter grew louder, and the orchestrated merriment of the evening carried on without her. In the back of her mind, she kept hearing that small, persistent voice, the one that had been whispering doubts in her ear for months. "This is not who you are. This is not where you belong." Jacqueline's gaze shifted once more to Thomas, and she felt a sudden wave of clarity wash over her. This marriage was not going to be the escape she had hoped for. It was not going to be the fairy tale. It was a transaction, a business deal that was already starting to feel like a prison. She had known it before, but now, standing in this room full of people, the reality of it seemed too great to ignore. And in that moment, Jacqueline knew that the future she had envisioned was no longer a possibility. The life she was about to live would be nothing like the one she had dreamed of. The unraveling moment. The reception continued, a cacophony of laughter, clinking glasses, and the soft strains of an orchestra that played in the background. The Randolph estate, which had once felt like a gilded cage, now seemed like an elaborate set in a play, with everyone assuming their roles and smiling at the appropriate moments. Jacqueline stood at the edge of the ballroom, sipping from a glass of champagne, though she could barely taste the bubbles. Her gaze wandered over the guests, well-dressed, flawless, playing their parts, and yet, she felt disconnected from it all. She wasn't one of them. She didn't belong in this world of pretense, where appearances mattered more than sincerity. Her parents had warned her about the superficiality of high society. They had told her not to let herself get lost in the glitter and glamour, not to let their world of wealth and tradition cloud her vision of who she truly was. But now, as she watched Thomas mingle with his family and their wealthy friends, she realized just how easy it was to slip into the illusion. It had been so gradual. The constant approval, the endless attention, it had felt like a validation of her worth. But now, standing in this sea of expectations and empty smiles, she couldn't help but feel more lost than ever. Thomas was a different man now, or at least a man in a different light. Throughout the ceremony, he had been the poised groom, the charming heir, the epitome of sophistication. But now, as he made his way through the crowd, exchanging pleasantries with guests, Jacqueline noticed something disturbing, a subtle shift in his demeanor. He was no longer the man she had grown accustomed to over the months of their engagement. His smile, which had seemed genuine at first, now appeared forced, calculated. His eyes, once so warm, were now cold, distant, as though he were more concerned with how his family perceived him than with the woman who had just become his wife. Jacqueline swallowed hard, her throat dry. She looked down at her glass, then back at Thomas, who was laughing at something his father had said. He was the center of attention, as he always had been, and Jacqueline found herself watching him, her stomach churning with an unfamiliar discomfort. Was this how it was always going to be? A marriage of convenience, a partnership of appearances, while their lives, his life, at least, continued to revolve around his status? For a moment, Jacqueline closed her eyes, as if trying to shake off the feeling that had settled in her chest. But the truth wouldn't leave her. She wasn't just a partner to Thomas. She was a symbol. She was the means by which his family's dying legacy would be reinvigorated. Her wealth, her family's name, had been the final piece to secure his place in the world. But what did he really see when he looked at her? Did he even know her? Did he care to know her? Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden burst of laughter from a nearby table. A group of Thomas's childhood friends had gathered together, all of them sipping champagne and reminiscing about old times. Jacqueline knew these men well. They were part of the privileged few who had grown up alongside Thomas, raised in the lap of luxury, never questioning their place in the world. They were refined, polished, men of distinction. And yet, as they spoke, Jacqueline could hear the condescension beneath their words, the subtle jabs at the world outside their circle. It was a language she was familiar with, a language of privilege and power. But tonight, it made her skin crawl. As she turned her gaze away from the group, her eyes caught on a familiar face, Maria, her best friend and maid of honor, standing near the grand staircase with a concerned expression on her face. Maria had been with Jacqueline since college, the one person who had always seen through the facade. Maria had never been impressed by wealth or status. She had always valued integrity, and Jacqueline had admired her for it. But now, as their eyes met across the room, Jacqueline saw the unspoken question in Maria's eyes, "Are you really okay?" Jacqueline tried to smile, but the effort felt hollow. She took a deep breath, then made her way toward Maria, her heels clicking against the polished marble floor. The closer she got, the more she could feel the weight of the evening's events bearing down on her. It was all happening so fast, and yet, it felt like everything was slipping through her fingers. As she reached Maria, the two exchanged a quick hug, and Maria immediately pulled back, her gaze narrowing with concern. "Jackie, you don't look right. Are you sure you're okay?" Maria asked softly, her voice barely audible above the hum of the party. Jacqueline hesitated for a moment, her thoughts swirling. She could feel the truth pressing against her chest like a suffocating weight. She had promised herself that she would play her part, that she would see this through. But now, standing in front of Maria, it was impossible to ignore the fact that she felt more like a puppet than a woman in love. "I'm fine," Jacqueline said, though her voice lacked conviction. "I'm just tired. It's a long day." Maria didn't buy it. She studied Jacqueline's face for a moment, then crossed her arms, her expression turning serious. "You don't have to pretend with me, you know. If something's wrong, you can tell me." Jacqueline forced a smile, but it was brittle, the cracks in her composure starting to show. "It's just a lot. This whole thing, it feels like a dream. A dream I don't quite fit into." Maria didn't respond right away. She just nodded, her eyes softening with understanding. "I get it. You're not the only one who feels that way." They stood in silence for a few moments, the weight of their unspoken thoughts hanging between them. But then, just as Jacqueline was about to speak again, a voice cut through the air. "There you are." Thomas's voice was cheerful, but Jacqueline could hear the faint hint of possessiveness in it. She turned, finding him walking toward them with an easy smile on his face. He reached out, taking her hand and pressing a quick kiss to her cheek, as if to show the world that his bride was by his side. "I was wondering when you'd join me. The guests are getting restless." Jacqueline's smile faltered for just a second, but she quickly masked it. "I'm here now," she replied, trying to keep her tone light. Thomas turned to Maria, offering her a charming smile. "Maria, always a pleasure. You're looking lovely tonight." Maria returned the smile, but there was a coldness to it, a subtle recognition of the situation at hand. "Thank you, Thomas. It's been quite a day, hasn't it? Thomas chuckled, his gaze flicking between Maria and Jacqueline. Indeed. The day has flown by, hasn't it? But now, it's time to let loose and enjoy ourselves. The real fun starts when we cut the cake, right? Jacqueline's stomach tightened at the mention of the cake. The grand, towering confection had been the centerpiece of the evening, and while it had been intended as a sweet symbol of their union, she couldn't shake the feeling that it represented something far more sinister. It was a perfect facade, just like the wedding itself, and as Thomas spoke, she could already picture what was coming. He was about to embarrass her. She could feel it in her gut. It was as though this was all a game to him, a performance in which he had scripted the roles and cast himself as the star. But what she didn't expect, what no one could have predicted, was that her reaction would be anything but what he was expecting. This wasn't going to be just another act in the performance of their marriage. This moment, this decision, would change everything. A moment of clarity. The cake cutting was supposed to be one of the highlight moments of the evening, a perfect display of marital joy and unity. Jacqueline had known this from the moment they had discussed the logistics of the wedding. It was always going to be about spectacle, about putting on a show for the guests. But now, as the moment approached, she couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. It wasn't just the grandeur of the moment or the weight of the tradition, it was the deep, unshakable knowledge that this moment was not for her, it was for Thomas. The crowd gathered around the towering cake, which stood like a sweetened monument in the center of the room. 3 massive layers, each decorated with delicate, hand-piped flowers in gold and ivory, crowned with an oversized sugar-crafted replica of the Randolph family crest. Jacqueline tried to focus on the beauty of the cake, the way the layers seemed to shimmer under the ballroom lights. But instead, all she could think about was the facade she was about to play into, a farce wrapped in sugar and frosting. Thomas, with his effortless charm, made his way toward the cake, offering Jacqueline his arm. She took it, though her grip was slightly hesitant. There was a pressure in the air now, thick and suffocating, as though everyone was holding their breath in anticipation. The guests smiled, their faces glowing under the ballroom's warm lighting, but Jacqueline couldn't help but feel cold inside. They weren't smiling at her, they were smiling at the spectacle of her life, at the perfect union they believed they were witnessing. Jacqueline's mind wandered again, her thoughts returning to the decision she had made that morning when she had put on that gown, that gleaming dress of expectation. She had thought it was her choice. But now, standing beside Thomas, feeling the weight of the gown pressing into her chest, she realized that she had never truly made the decision herself. This was a choice she had inherited from those around her, the ones who had dictated what she should want, what she should value, what was expected of her. And now, she was trapped in that very decision. "Are you ready, darling?" Thomas's voice broke through her thoughts. His hand rested on her waist, and he looked down at her with a glimmer of affection that seemed more like a performance than a genuine emotion. The smile he wore was flawless, but something about it struck Jacqueline as hollow, like a mask he had perfected over the years to fit the expectations of his family and society. Jacqueline didn't respond immediately. She simply nodded, the motion slow and deliberate, as if she were moving through thick fog. She had been so careful, so composed all evening, but the cracks were beginning to show. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she could feel the cold sweat on the back of her neck. The moment of truth was coming, and for the first time since the wedding began, Jacqueline felt a surge of something other than dread, anger. Her hand gripped Thomas's arm a little tighter than necessary, and for a brief moment, she saw a flicker of surprise cross his face. But before he could comment, the moment was upon them. The cake, grand and gleaming, awaited their touch. Thomas stepped forward and took the ceremonial knife in hand, his movements precise and practiced. His smile widened as he cut the first slice of cake, lifting it with exaggerated elegance, as though the act itself were some grand gesture of love and devotion. He turned toward Jacqueline, ready to offer her the first bite. The guests watched in eager anticipation, their eyes trained on the couple, their gazes fixed on the perfect picture of marital bliss that was about to unfold. But Jacqueline, in that fleeting moment of clarity, realized something profound. This moment was not hers. It was never hers. It was a performance, a show to placate the crowd, to satisfy the desires of those who had forced her into this role. Thomas wasn't offering her love. He was offering her a role to play, a part she hadn't chosen. As he turned to face her, holding the slice of cake in his hand, something inside Jacqueline snapped. She didn't take the cake. She didn't smile. Instead, she took a sharp step back, her heart racing. The sudden movement caught everyone by surprise. The room fell into a stunned silence. Thomas, who had been expecting a sweet, light-hearted moment of laughter, froze. His eyes widened in confusion, then narrowed as the realization set in. Jacqueline wasn't playing her part. She wasn't following the script. For a second, no one moved. The guests exchanged uncertain glances, unsure of what to do. Thomas, still holding the piece of cake, tried to recover. He chuckled nervously, stepping forward. "Come on, Jackie. Don't be shy. It's just a bit of fun, a tradition." But Jacqueline wasn't in the mood for traditions anymore. She wasn't here to play along, to pretend, to continue this charade for the benefit of others. The years of carefully curated politeness, the hours spent perfecting a smile, the constant game of appearances, it was all a lie. She was tired of pretending. "Fun?" Jacqueline's voice broke through the silence, her tone sharp and clear. The room seemed to hold its breath. "You think this is fun?" Thomas faltered, the smile faltering on his face as he blinked in disbelief. "What are you talking about, Jackie? It's just a joke. Lighten up." But Jacqueline stood taller now, the words coming faster, more forcefully than she had expected. "No, Thomas. It's not a joke. It's your game. It's your performance. And I'm done being part of it." There was a long, stunned silence. For the first time, Jacqueline's words seemed to strike at something deeper than just surface-level embarrassment. Her declaration hit like a thunderclap, shaking the foundation of everything she had been led to believe. The guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging glances, unsure of how to react. This was not the perfect wedding they had imagined. This was not the show they had been promised. There was no laughter, no applause, no easy compliance. Jacqueline stood there, defiant, her eyes locked on Thomas's. And then, in one swift, unplanned motion, Jacqueline turned to face the cake. Without warning, she grabbed a large handful of frosting, and before Thomas could react, she smeared it across his face with surprising force. The cake's delicate layers of frosting and sugar splattered across his perfectly pressed suit and his shocked expression. The room gasped in unison. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Thomas stood frozen, his hand still holding the plate, his expression a mix of shock, anger, and disbelief. The guests, some of them stifling giggles, others clearly unsure of what to do, watched in stunned silence. Jacqueline's heart pounded, but as she stood there, her hands still in the air, she felt something inside her release. Her gaze never left Thomas's face. The room felt heavy with tension. No one dared to speak, not yet. Jacqueline had just done something unthinkable, something that would change the course of the evening, and perhaps her entire life. For the first time, Jacqueline felt free. The act was impulsive, reckless even, but it was real. She wasn't going to be the perfect bride anymore, not for anyone, not for Thomas, not for the crowd. This moment, this unexpected, shocking moment, was the first real thing she had done in a long time. And in that moment, she didn't care what anyone thought. Thomas slowly wiped the frosting from his face, his mouth twitching as though he were trying to understand what had just happened. But Jacqueline wasn't interested in explanations. She wasn't interested in playing his game anymore. "This is who I am, Thomas," she said, her voice steady now, her eyes burning with something fierce and powerful. "I'm not your accessory. I'm not your trophy wife. I'm a person, and I'm done being invisible in this marriage." She turned away from him, her back straight, her footsteps deliberate as she walked away from the center of attention. She could hear whispers rising behind her, but she didn't care. She had made her choice. For the first time in years, she had taken control of her own narrative. The moment had arrived. And Jacqueline was no longer willing to play a part in the story everyone else had written for her. The fallout. The aftermath of Jacqueline's outburst was like a ripple that spread through a still pond, growing wider and more turbulent with each passing second. The room, once filled with the soft hum of conversation and the clinking of glasses, was now eerily silent. The suddenness of the moment left everyone stunned, frozen in disbelief, as if they hadn't fully processed what had just happened. Jacqueline stood near the edge of the ballroom, her back to the crowd, her chest rising and falling in rapid breaths. The shock of her actions still coursed through her, but now, there was something else there, too: relief. A strange kind of liberation. Thomas was still standing at the center of the room, the frosting dripping from his face in slow, sticky streams. His eyes were wide, the shock of the situation settling in. He didn't move. His hand, still holding the shattered plate, trembled slightly. For a few moments, it seemed like the room was holding its breath, waiting for someone, anyone, to break the silence. But it was Jacqueline who broke it first. Turning on her heel, she glanced back at Thomas, who still hadn't moved from where she had left him, looking more like a child than the poised heir to a fortune. His face was a mixture of disbelief and humiliation, but as Jacqueline met his gaze, something inside her flickered, something that had long been smoldering but had never truly ignited until this moment. She could see the gears turning in his head, the effort to regain control of the situation. But it was already too late for that. "Are you done?" she asked coolly, her voice sharp, every word cutting through the tension in the room like a blade. "Are you done with the charade, Thomas?" "Because I am. I've been done for a long time." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Jacqueline almost felt as though she were speaking to herself as much as to him. She had spent so many years trying to play along with the expectations, trying to mold herself into someone she wasn't, and now the truth had come spilling out, raw and unfiltered. She had stood by, silent for so long, watching him play his part, and now, it was time for her to stop pretending. The guests, who had been holding their breath, now began to murmur, the tension in the room palpable. Jacqueline could hear the whispers, the uncertainty, the disbelief. They didn't know how to react. They had been expecting the typical wedding evening, filled with laughter, speeches, toasts, and the traditional photographs that captured the smiling faces of the perfect couple. Instead, they had witnessed a scene that shattered their expectations. Jacqueline felt the weight of their stares pressing in on her. She could hear the whispers behind her back, the judgment laced in every word. What was she thinking? Was this some sort of outburst, a temper tantrum from a spoiled bride? The questions rolled in like a storm, but Jacqueline didn't flinch. She had made her choice, and there was no going back now. Thomas, now beginning to recover from the shock of the moment, wiped his face with a handkerchief, his expression hardening. He looked up at her, his jaw clenched tightly. "You think this is funny?" he spat, his voice low and dangerous. "This is my wedding, Jacqueline. You ruined it. You've made a mockery of everything." Jacqueline's heart didn't race. Instead, it slowed, almost like the calm after the storm. She had been expecting this. She had been expecting him to blame her, to throw the humiliation back onto her like a weapon. But she wasn't afraid anymore. She was done being afraid. "This wasn't your wedding, Thomas," she said, her voice even and firm, though her anger simmered just beneath the surface. "This was a performance. You didn't marry me for love, you married me because it suited you. Your family needed me, and I needed to get out of the cage you've tried to trap me in. But now, I'm done." Her words hit like a punch, each one landing with a force that shook the air around them. The guests continued to murmur, but Jacqueline didn't care. She turned to face the room, every eye on her, every whisper like a soft hum in the distance. But she was no longer listening. She was beyond the need for their approval, beyond the need to maintain any kind of pretense. For a moment, Thomas stood there, stunned by her words. His face flickered between anger, disbelief, and something else, a fleeting look of realization, perhaps, or the first inkling of understanding. But the moment passed quickly, and his anger returned, sharper than before. He took a step toward her, his expression darkening. "You're making a huge mistake," he said, his voice low and cold. "You think walking away from me will solve everything? You'll regret this, Jacqueline. You'll regret throwing away everything we've built." But Jacqueline didn't flinch. She wasn't the woman he had once thought her to be, someone willing to sacrifice her own happiness for the sake of his family's image. She wasn't some passive player in the game he had designed. She was done. "I've already built my life, Thomas," she said, her voice unwavering. "I've built it on my own terms, without your family's legacy or your name attached to it. You don't get to control me anymore. And I'm not going to live a life that isn't mine. Not for you. Not for anyone." The words settled in the air, thick with finality. There was no going back. She had made her decision. She had walked away from the gilded cage of wealth and status. She had stepped out of the world of facades and lies. She was free. Behind her, the guests exchanged looks, their curiosity now mixing with concern. They had witnessed something truly shocking, a bride walking away from her own wedding, from a life she had been expected to cherish. The quiet hum of the crowd grew louder, the whispers more insistent, but Jacqueline ignored them all. She didn't care about their judgments, their opinions. She had come here for one reason, to break free. And she had done it. As she walked toward the exit, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor, she could feel the eyes of the room following her every step. But she didn't look back. She didn't need to. There was nothing more for her here. Her future was outside of this house, outside of this world. A future she would build for herself, on her own terms. Just before she reached the door, a voice called out to her, familiar, but distant. "Jacqueline." She turned slightly, her heart still racing, but her resolve as firm as steel. It was Maria, standing at the edge of the room, her eyes filled with concern, but also with something more, something that Jacqueline couldn't quite place. Maria was the one person who had known her through all of this, the expectations, the silent battles, the compromises. "I'm proud of you," Maria said, her voice soft but full of meaning. Jacqueline paused for a moment, her heart swelling with a strange mixture of emotions. She had always worried about letting others down, about disappointing the people who cared for her. But now, as Maria's words hit her, she realized that she hadn't disappointed anyone. She had liberated herself. With a final glance toward her friend, Jacqueline stepped out of the ballroom and into the night. The cool air hit her face, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of clarity wash over her. She was free, no longer trapped by expectations, no longer weighed down by the false ideals of a life she hadn't chosen. It was the beginning of something new. Something real. And Jacqueline Morris was ready to embrace it. The unexpected outcome. In the months following her dramatic departure from the Randolph estate, Jacqueline's life began to take on a new rhythm. At first, it had been a whirlwind of media coverage, phone calls from both well-meaning friends and family, and the inevitable public scrutiny. But as time passed, the chaos began to subside, and in its place emerged a quieter, more deliberate existence. Jacqueline had become a symbol, a woman who had walked away from privilege and the expectations of others to reclaim her life on her own terms. But this wasn't something she could fully embrace without first confronting the most significant challenge of all, rebuilding herself. When she first left the wedding, the idea of living without the structure she had been raised in felt alien to her. She had always been told that wealth, status, and appearance were the ultimate markers of success. Her identity had been tied to the idea of being the perfect match in a powerful marriage, playing the part of the successful, polished wife to someone who, on the surface, seemed to embody everything she had ever been taught to desire. Walking away from that had been a statement, but it was also terrifying. It was in the solitude of her small apartment in the city where she began the process of discovery. The apartment was modest by any standard, a stark contrast to the sprawling rooms of the Randolph estate. It was located in a quiet corner of town, away from the circles she had once frequented, and it was here, surrounded by simple furniture and her own thoughts, that Jacqueline felt the first stirrings of freedom. Her days were filled with a new kind of routine, one that was defined by purpose rather than obligation. She spent her mornings at her desk, poring over new business ideas and research, reconnecting with the ventures that had always interested her but had been overshadowed by her engagement and subsequent marriage. She had always been passionate about technology, innovation, and how the world could be shaped through these industries. The more she immersed herself in these passions, the more she found herself in the company of people who valued ideas and progress over appearance and legacy. This was the life she had always wanted but had never felt free enough to live. Jacqueline began to form her own startups, each one aimed at improving the lives of people in marginalized communities by giving them access to technological advancements. She worked tirelessly, drawing on her knowledge and expertise to create opportunities that reflected her values. Her work became an extension of herself, something that no one could take from her. It wasn't glamorous, and there were moments of failure and doubt, but it felt authentic, and that authenticity gave her the strength to keep going. As her professional life flourished, Jacqueline also began to reclaim her personal life. She reached out to old friends, people she had distanced herself from during her engagement and marriage. These were people who knew her for who she truly was, not as an accessory to a man or an idealized image of the perfect wife. It was in these relationships that she began to rediscover the joy of simple, genuine connection. The conversations were unfiltered, the laughter real, and for the first time in years, Jacqueline felt seen, not as a symbol, but as a person. Her relationship with her parents, too, shifted. While they had always supported her, they had also placed expectations on her, expectations to marry well, to secure her place in society, and to uphold the family's reputation. At first, her choice to leave the marriage had been a disappointment to them. They had believed in the union between Jacqueline and Thomas as a way of securing her future and cementing their own place in the elite circles they had worked so hard to enter. But as they saw Jacqueline thrive on her own, as she forged her own path and began to find success without relying on the trappings of wealth and status, they began to understand. They had always valued her independence, and it was in this independence that Jacqueline had truly become the person they had hoped she would be. It wasn't always easy. There were moments when the loneliness of her new life crept in, when the weight of her decision to leave everything behind felt overwhelming. In those moments, she would remind herself that the choice to walk away was never about rejecting love, it was about rejecting a life that was not hers. It was about being true to herself, no matter the cost. Through her work, Jacqueline became known in the tech world for her visionary approach to bridging the gap between technology and social justice. She built a network of like-minded entrepreneurs and activists, people who shared her desire to make a meaningful impact in the world. Her projects ranged from educational platforms that taught coding to underprivileged youth to sustainable innovations in clean energy for remote communities. These were initiatives that carried meaning beyond profit margins. They were her way of contributing to a future that wasn't bound by tradition or the constraints of old money. But Jacqueline's impact wasn't just in her work. Her decision to leave a life of privilege and pursue something that was deeply aligned with her values spoke volumes. It became a catalyst for others to reconsider their own lives, to question the roles they were playing, and to ask themselves whether they, too, were living in a way that honored their authentic selves. Jacqueline became a quiet but powerful voice in a growing movement of individuals who were choosing to create their own destinies, free from the societal pressures that dictated who they should be and how they should live. Despite the quiet victories, however, Jacqueline did have moments of vulnerability. There were times when she questioned whether she had made the right decision, whether the life she had chosen, this life of independence and purpose, was truly what she wanted. She missed the idea of family gatherings, the sense of belonging that came with being part of a powerful legacy. She missed the idea of partnership, of having someone by her side who was equally invested in building something together. But in those moments of doubt, Jacqueline found solace in her own company. She didn't need external validation. She was learning to validate herself. And then, one evening, as she was hosting a small gathering at her apartment, something unexpected happened. One of her old friends, a fellow entrepreneur who had seen her transformation from the outside, commented, "Jacqueline, you've become the woman we all knew you could be. You've created your own story, one that's not defined by anyone else's expectations. You're living proof that it's never too late to start over, to rewrite your narrative." Those words stuck with her. They summed up everything she had been through, everything she had worked for. She wasn't just a woman who had walked away from a marriage, she was a woman who had learned how to take ownership of her own story, to write the chapters that mattered to her. The pieces of her life, once fractured and lost in the pursuit of someone else's ideal, had come together to form something strong and unbreakable. It was then that Jacqueline realized something profound: she wasn't just rebuilding herself. She was redefining what it meant to live a meaningful life. The idea of success, of happiness, wasn't something she had inherited. It wasn't something handed to her. It was something she had created herself. Through hard work, resilience, and a commitment to authenticity, she had built a life that was truly her own. As the years passed, Jacqueline's story became a source of inspiration for countless people. She didn't need the admiration of the old money elite, the applause of society's high circles. She had found something far more valuable: peace, purpose, and the knowledge that she was living life on her own terms. The perfect wedding, the grand estate, the legacy of the Randolphs, all of that was behind her now. In its place was a future built on her values, her dreams, and her willingness to embrace the unknown. In the end, Jacqueline discovered that the greatest freedom came not from escaping the life she was born into, but from embracing the power to create a life that was entirely her own. She had been through the fire, and she had emerged stronger, wiser, and unshaken. The journey was far from over, but Jacqueline was no longer afraid of the unknown. She was ready to face whatever came next, knowing that, whatever it was, she would be the one to define it.